Arrow, and I will be one of your hosts tonight. Tonight we're looking at and going to be learning a lot about the historical background for the causes of Mexican and Central American migration. Our presenter will be Dr. Gail Presbey from the University of Detroit-Mercy. But before I present Gail, I'd like to let you know that we're going to be taking a break about midway through, with the idea that if you have any questions as we're going along, that you would go down to the bottom of your screen to the chat button as you hear the issue, and jot down your question and send it to, it'll give you a choice of who to send it to, and send it to Rosemary Inslee, who will be managing and facilitating our discussion. So we'll have time during that little break and then again at the end. So I just want you to know that that's a possibility for yourself. And that'll help us just kind of move along, because it takes a while otherwise for people to, unmute themselves, ask their question, whatever, and this will kind of expedite it. So now let me introduce Dr. Gail Presbey. Dr. Gail Presbey is an instructor at the University of Detroit-Mercy, as I said, in the areas of the history of philosophy and theology. And interestingly, a good amount of her studies have been in political philosophy. She's done a good deal of research and has focused her efforts in African countries, in India, and in Latin America. So she brings a depth and a breadth of information for us. I know that you're going to find her presentation most interesting and valuable. So Gail, would you enrich us with your background and your knowledge? Thank you.
Oh, now I'm going to try to do the share screen. Can you see this screen?
Not yet. We can't see it yet, Gail. So hit the share screen button.
Okay, I thought I did. I'll try one more time.
There you go. We're starting to see it now. There we go.
Can you also hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. You're all set.
Okay.
Just put it on present now, and you're set, Gail.
I want to accept the waiting room messages on top of where I click present mode.
You can just move. You can move that box then if there's a box blocking you.
Let me see if I can move the box. Well, I don't. If you admit that person, maybe underneath there I can get to my.
If you move your cursor at the top of the box where the participant number is, you can move the whole thing. Or you can put the X and just get rid of it. Hit the X there in the top right corner
Now
of
I
the box.
see. Slideshow. Sorry. Sorry, folks. Did not foresee.
That's okay.
I did not foresee that the controls would be on top.
There you go. You're good.
Okay. So now I want to start out with my presentation. I'm going to go over the history, focusing on Mexico and Central America, because so much of our current migration comes from those two countries. And okay, so now let's start by asking the question, what is America and who are we as Americans? And I just want to point out that although the word America isn't United States of America, it's also the name of continents, North, South, and Central America. And folks from those places outside of the US also call themselves Americans. So let's think about, what does it mean to be American? And there are different senses of the word. In these two books, we see Dr. Orozco here has noted that the whole question of who are Americans has been debated for centuries in our country. And Also, Juan Gonzalez in his book talks about how Latino Americans have been part of America for a very long time, and yet sometimes we still treat them like foreigners. They may have been here for generations. They may have gotten here even before we did. So that's something to think about. Now, it's also important to realize immigrants today, according to this Pew study, account for 13.6 of the US population. So that's a substantial amount. Well, it's been that way for a long time. If you looked in 1890, you would see that 14.8% of people living in the US time were immigrants. So we really are a nation of immigrants. Waves of immigrants have been coming to our country for decades and make up now who we consider to be Americans. So I'm focusing again, like I suggested, on Mexico and Central America because there were so many, 25% from Mexico, another 8% from Central America, a third of our immigrants are coming from this region, and you can see this region here in the map. Now, my presentation has 5 parts, broken up into the different histories. So first we have part 1. We're going to go to the early Mesoamerican civilizations. This is focused on both places we now call Mexico and Central America, but 2,000 years ago through to the last 500 years, we are going to first look briefly at that era, and then go to part 2, where we're going to take a look at the consolidation of the US 48 states and how that consolidation includes areas that had been part of Mexico, for example. Then part 3 is going to look at US imperialism and military intervention in Latin America, focusing 1898 to 1960s. In part 4, we're going to look at liberation theology as it developed from the 1960s to 80s. And we're also going to look at the Central American wars, civil wars in the 70s and 80s. And hopefully we'll still have time for part 5, looking at the last 30 years, NAFTA, politics, drugs, gangs, climate change, and how that impacts the immigrant situation today. So it's a tall order, but hopefully you can stick with me. We will have a break, a short break for questions after part 3, and then more time for questions at the end. So first now we are going to take a look at the early Mesoamerican civilizations and early Spanish settlement. So first of all, Mexico and Central America have a long history filled with amazing accomplishments. Did you know, for example, that the corn we know now was domesticated from a wild grass around 7,000 BCE? And also at the time that Columbus arrived, there were already 100 million people living in the Americas. I can't tell you about all of them, but I will tell you about the Mayan civilization. Starting as early as 2600 BCE, it's before the Common Era, it's the same as before Christ. Mayan civilization developed great cities. They had writing and glyphs since the 3rd century BCE. They had amazing architecture, including large pyramids and many religious buildings. They had skilled artisans. They had developed religious ideas and practices, and were also keen astronomers and knew all about the stars, equinox, solstice, etc. Now, I can't tell you about everything, but I can hopefully tell you about these middle ones. You see in the middle, Teotihuacan, Monte Alban, and Palenque of the Maya. They are going to be ones that I will focus on in the next few slides. You can see their time frame. So we're talking about the mid-thousands. CE, Common Era, same as AD, Anno Domini, our contemporary years. So for example, there's Teotihuacan, which I was happy to see myself. This was about 40 miles outside of Mexico City, and at its height, it had over 100,000 people living there. And they had large pyramids, very complex society. This is a very quick tour. Let's go now to Monte Alban, a place I was also very happy to visit. It's a mountain just next to the contemporary city of Oaxaca. And this stela was my favorite when I toured there. It has the reliefs of 4 women rulers of Monte Alban. So this is an ancient society where women sometimes ruled. And this is the Zapotec indigenous group, which still lives in this area of Oaxaca in Mexico today. You may know these famous Mayan pyramids like Copan in Honduras and Tikal in Guatemala. Maya were also in southern Mexico. For example, Palenque here, Palace of Pakal the Great, the entire complex laid out using solar alignments. And then, as you know, Columbus came to the Caribbean islands, and Cortez came in 1519 and conquered Tenochtitlan, the city, the Mexica city, Aztec city, located in our contemporary Mexico City. He used force and he brought Catholicism to the Americas. And many Catholic religious orders came with him. And members of those orders both destroyed and sometimes preserved Mayan culture. And as I mentioned, they had writing. So some of their codices, which were fig bark books that had a lot of the details of Maya ideas. So many of them were destroyed, some were saved. And in this way, Catholicism spread to northern Mexico, that is now part of the Southwest US. So how did Catholicism come to the Americas? Well, there was a haste to baptize. There was maybe little teaching done, but remember, this is also how it was done in Europe, because in Europe, a king or a queen may decide on behalf of their subjects what religion they will all follow. This is a picture of the Metropolitan Cathedral. It's on the main square, the Zocalo in Mexico City. And to build this cathedral in 1519, the Spanish used some of the stones in the big temple, the Templo Mayor, the Mexica temple, was right behind it. So they destroyed that temple. They took its stones to build their church. And so we can learn a lot. There is a museum. So in addition to seeing this church, you can go into the museum and we can learn that this temple was, the Mexica temple was set up to, with alignments so that when the sun rose and set on special days like the equinox and the solstice, it cast particular shadows, and it was also aligned with a whole agricultural calendar, if you know about the Aztec calendar. These were important aspects of Aztec religion. And the Catholics wanted to be on top of it and the new religion for everyone. Now, there were always some humanitarians among the Franciscans and others who came, and some of them did serious studies of Aztec history, Maya history. And some of them, like these two, Bartolome de las Casas and Father Antonio de Montesinos, both of them were speaking out against the harm that some of the colonizers were doing to Native Americans at the time. Because really many of those Indians died while they were in some kind of forced servitude. Even if it wasn't called slavery, it was some kind of forced servitude. There was always a voice of conscience. Now, I already told you about how the southwest corner of contemporary US was taken over by the Spanish. The Spanish also came to Florida. And in this map, you can see St. Augustine was over there on the right-hand side. You can see the Soto and others land in St. Augustine. And a whole string of Spanish missions were set up along the Georgia coast and then across to the Florida coast. Aha. Okay, so here's St. Augustine, the Georgia ones. And basically, there were already Native American towns and settlements here. Basically, what happens is the Spanish would chum up the chiefs and say, don't you want to let us put our mission in the middle of your town? And we'll be trading partners for you. And then what can you do for us? You can provide us with some labor. Labor went to St. Augustine, and in this way, diseases spread across to Native American communities. But this whole area was settled by the Spanish, and some Native Americans did embrace Catholicism. And they were bought because further north here in South Carolina, you had English settlers who aligned with certain Indian tribes to attack those missions in Georgia and drive out the Spanish Catholics. Okay, now let's go on to part 2, Manifest Destiny and Consolidation of the U.S. 48 states. Now, you might have heard this saying, we didn't cross the border crossed us. What do we mean? Well, the border of the U.S. kept getting larger. It kept spreading westward. So this brown area of the map was the territory of the original 13 states. And then I already mentioned that Florida, we got Florida through the Spanish succession. And then we bought this Louisiana Purchase from France. This place that we bought land from was already peopled, not only by Native Americans who were living there, but also European peoples of ethnic French, Spanish, and Mexican descent who were largely Catholic, and enslaved Africans. So all of these folks now also become part of the US territory. And there's the whole question of, will the Anglo settlers continue their idea that they are the Americans? How will the United States of America see itself incorporating all these many different people? And then it continues, and with sometimes with secession and sometimes with war and some violence, finally those other territories will also become part of the US. I just want to let you know, though, remember we were talking about the Spanish colonizers. But as you know, the U.S. got its independence from Great Britain in 1776. So the American Revolution was all about, we're not going to be a colony. We're going to have independence. We're going to rule ourselves. Well, those ideas caught on. Not only did the French have that in the French Revolution, but then the Haitians had their revolution. And this whole area, which was part of the Spanish Empire, of course, Brazil was part of the Portuguese Empire, but all of these places declared independence from 1810 to 1839. And in the case of Mexico, Mexico declared independence 1810, but they had to fight for it until 1821 when they finally had their independence. And as you can see in this map, so Mexico gets its name in 1821, and we have the United Provinces of Central America, actually from 1824 to 1830. But it didn't last long, and then it broke into the individual countries we know today. These wars of independence were all focused on this idea. We must have our own government and not be colonies. Back in the US, starting around 1845, there was this popular idea of manifest destiny. This idea the United States was destined by God to exist from coast to coast between the two oceans. And some of that had to do with a scramble for new states to find out, would these new states be slave states, as in practicing slavery legally, or free states that would outlaw slavery? So this is part of the idea behind this expansion. So then there is the US-Mexican War. And I'm going quite quickly over this, but we can say that the whole idea behind it was the US should be able to expand. So Texas, already Anglo settlers had been coming into the area with permission of the Mexican state. It said, you can stay there if you declare yourselves Catholics and say that you are loyal to our state, to our government. And they said that, but really they wanted an uprising. And then they became independent, a Lone Star state, and then they joined the US. You also had people from Oregon attacking California, this Bear Flag Revolt. And there were a series of wars that basically attacked Mexico and finally took about half of Mexico's territory. This entire north area became part of the US. And now we go on to part 3. So part 3, US imperialism and military intervention in Latin America. And this map is just an overview. There are quite a few times that the US government gets involved militarily, well, in all of Latin America, but we're just going to focus on this area. Let's take a look at these first two. First here, Puerto Rico and Panama, and well, and Cuba as well, briefly. So there is, oh, wait, I forgot to tell you, if you look on the left, why do we call this neo-colonialism? Because a lot of the foreign policy is being, has as a motivator, getting these foreign crops or foreign mining. And so there's an economic influence to the intent to have the military and intervention. Now, there's the Spanish-American War, and this is where the US decides to get involved. Cubans had already been fighting for their independence. And the US decides, they say, oh, we're going to help Cuba get its independence from those terrible Spaniards? But really, they were concerned about U.S. Uh, companies already had a lot of businesses in Cuba. Cuba maintained its independence, but there were rules like the Platt Amendment that basically said the U.S. could intervene militarily at any time it deemed necessary. The U.S. also conquered Puerto Rico at this time in 1898-99. In 1901, there was a Supreme Court case called the Insular Cases, where they said, you know, even though we've conquered Puerto Rico, they shouldn't be a state because the people of Puerto Rico just couldn't understand Anglo-Saxon law. So they shouldn't be incorporated as citizens in a state. And so they become a territory. They finally do get US citizenship in 1917. That's just because the US wants to draft them during World War I to go and protect the Panama Canal. So let's turn next to the Panama Canal. This happens during Teddy Roosevelt time. And just to let you know, well, what kind of actions is the US government doing? So Teddy Roosevelt really wanted to build the Panama Canal, but Colombia didn't want it. And at the time, Panama was a peninsula of Colombia. Well, Teddy Roosevelt found some folks in Panama who thought they would like to secede, and he helped, giving them arms and military protection. And as soon as they succeeded in seceding from Colombia, they signed an agreement with the US. The US could build the canal and have a big canal zone on each side of the canal. It would be under US control. Now, what was going on in Mexico at the time? Diaz was ruling Mexico for many years, about 35 years, and he was friendly to US interests. During that time, there was a sharper division of the rich and the poor, and there was land expropriation of the Indians, decreasing wages of wage laborers. Because of this built-up tension, there was the Mexican Revolution. And the Mexican Revolution, which I'm going over quickly, had a constitution, and that new constitution said there would be free, secular, democratic education. There would be land reform, which would include restoring the ejidos, which were commonly held lands of the Native Americans, giving those lands back to the Native Americans who had lost it. And agricultural resources that were expropriated would be given back, and there would be workers' rights, including unionization. So the Mexican Revolution brought in a revolutionary government. A little bit later in the 1930s, we have President Cardenas of Mexico, who engages in further land reform, and he even nationalizes the oil of Mexico. But at that time, here in the US, we had Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he wanted to be good neighbors with Latin America, and he didn't want to continue these old processes of dictating to Latin America, getting the military involved. So as a good neighbor, he did not attack Cardenas for any of his work at that time. However, next door in Guatemala, during this time period, we have Ubico ruling Guatemala, and during that time, Ubico is very friendly with a company called United Fruit. He gives massive land parcels to United Fruit, which displace many of the Mayan people, which I told you about at the beginning of this presentation. So the Mayas are losing ground and United Fruit, which has some connections to powerful people in the US government, is gaining ground. Also at this time, Cold War, you know, the World War II is finished, the Cold War is starting up, and the US builds a school called School of the Americas, originally built in Panama, later moved to Fort Benning in 1984. And this school does not only teach military strategy and tactics to Latin American troops at no cost, you know, so as a benefit to them, but it's also a way for US military to forge ties of friendship and alliances with the military members across Latin America, perhaps to get intelligence or call favors in the future. Okay, then there is, because Guatemalans have lost so much land, there's 2 new presidents. And I'm on my last 2 slides. Arevalo, he was a philosopher who believed in what he called spiritual socialism. And this spiritual socialism was his alternative, not the anti-communism of the Marxists, but not capitalist exploitation either. In his footsteps comes the next democratically elected president, Arbenz, and they start doing land reform. Because United Fruit doesn't like it, United Fruit convinces the US government to play a role in toppling Arbenz, the democratically elected governor. So during this time period, and we'll see more and more, the Cold War takes effect, the US backed a colonel that they liked, Armas, because he was an anti-communist, and they did this work clandestinely. It's called covert operations. And some of these covert operations, the toppling, were okayed by some Catholics who thought we have to fight communism. But other Catholics, like the Maryknoll missioners, noticed the Maya people were suffering and they thought it was unfair and they protested. And maybe some of you who know this famous Catonsville 9 protest that happened with the Berrigans in the US, you might have thought it was all about Vietnam, but actually several of those protesters had been Maryknoll missioners in Guatemala. And they had seen Maya people suffer by this coup and the repression that came after it, and they wanted to speak out against it. Okay, so that was my first 3 parts, and now I will pause for some questions.
So if anybody has a question, you could just write it in the chat function. I haven't seen anything come in so far.
Okay. I'm going to turn on a light.
Anybody have questions so far? Not so far. So Gail, you can go ahead and keep going. And we'll take more questions at the end.
Okay, no problem. I hope you're all still with me. I look forward to your questions at the end. Okay, let's go to part 4. Liberation theology in the 60s and 80s, and the Central American Wars of the 70s and 80s. So, there were several US interventions during the Cold War. They'll be different than the earlier interventions. It's not always bringing in US troops. Oftentimes it's an influence, like sharing some intelligence or sending funds. We'll be looking at several of these examples here. Not all of them, but a few of them. Now, when we talk about Latin American liberation theology. Let me try to explain that it was seen as an alternative to what Joe Hill used to say in his story. Religion offers you pie in the sky when you die. In other words, in this world you're laboring, but the Bible says just be a good laborer and your reward will be in heaven. Well, then you had the Marxists or the communists saying, no, you're being sold a bill of goods. You have to fight for your rights now. This is just pacifying you to say, wait for heaven. Okay. So how was the church in Latin America going to respond to this kind of critique? At the same time, you also had Protestant churches coming in and saying, Catholics, you can't just presume you're going to keep all your Catholics. Protestants can also get some folks to convert to Protestantism. And in this context is part of how the ideas of Latin American liberation theology started. There was also a European context. The European background had to do with, pre-Vatican II, there was this idea of the church. It's a pyramid, and God's grace shines down on the Pope and the clergy, and then the Pope and the clergy take care of the people. But Vatican II said, no, the church is the people. And there were many people, and there were theologians like Jacques Maritain and Teilhard de Chardin in Europe who were talking about God reveals God's love for humanity through history and through people's struggles. And these ideas percolated in the minds also of the Latin American liberation theologians. Okay, so then who were they? Well, you had Gustavo Gutierrez, you had Leonardo Boff. He wrote books and gave talks. They influenced key bishops like Dom Helder Camara, and even Pope Paul VI in his exhortation said, church has the duty of assisting the birth of this liberation. So he said, well, yes, there is heaven. Yes, we will have an afterlife, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't now labor in solidarity with the poor for liberation in this world. And then there were two general episcopates in Latin America, the first one in Medellin, Colombia, and then in Puebla, Mexico, where it talked about the church must listen to the cry of the poor and become the interpreter of their anguish. Now I'm going to go through just 4 examples of liberation theology. We're going to start taking a look at what happened down here in Nicaragua, and we're going to go on and take a look at the other countries. So, in 1979, the Sandinistas came to power. They had just been fighting against a family of dictators, the Somoza family, that had been in power for decades. And they came, and they were certainly leftists, and they were certainly inspired in a broad sense by the Cuban Revolution, but they had their own ideas. They were Nicaraguans. And there were 2 Catholic priests who actually helped form their new government, and that was Ernesto and Fernando Cardenal. They became ministers of culture and ministers of education. Now, while Pope John Paul II didn't think they should hold office, it doesn't mean that liberation theology was rejected. The idea that the church must walk with the poor, this idea of liberation theology, they argued, and Fernando Cardenal argued, is deeply rooted, for example, ever since Rerum Novarum in 1891, where you had the church saying materialist capitalism is bad for people. So is communism, but they wanted something humane in the middle. And that's what Fernando Cardenal said he worked for his entire life in Nicaragua. And he called it democratic socialism. Now, it was the 1980s. The Cold War was going on. So remember, the US is competing with the Soviet Union and thinking, we don't want any communists like the Sandinistas. And Reagan made sure that our Navy was mining the harbors of Nicaragua. But do you know that Nicaragua took the US to court in The Hague, and the World Court found the US guilty of war crimes? I think as Americans, we don't always know that, but that was an important finding. There's also a complex case that is called the Iran-Contra scandal. Let me try to recap it in a nutshell. So at this time in the 80s, Congress had forbidden funding of the Contras. The Contras were a group that had Honduran soldiers that had been loyal to the Somoza family who wanted to throw out the Sandinistas. So they had their base in Honduras and they were attacking Nicaragua across the border, aiming at hospitals and schools. So because Congress told the Reagan administration, you can't give them money, Reagan had Oliver North and others find out ways to get those folks money. And part of it had to do with the clandestine arms deal with Iran that was found out later, but they denied it at the time. And there was also turning a blind eye to some of the drug running the Contras were doing. And in this way, they were getting funds to attack Nicaragua. So with that in mind, let's now take a look at Honduras. So I was just telling you about Honduras-Nicaragua border. And the Contras are over here in Honduras. There's also a big US Army base here in Honduras. So the US didn't want Honduras to have a revolution like Nicaragua had. One of the liberation theologians in Honduras was Father James Guadalupe Carney. You may know our university has an archive of his papers, and I'm director of that archive at University of Detroit Mercy. Well, Father Carney was ordained a Jesuit in 1961 and sent to Honduras. While he was there, he learned about liberation theology. He became convinced of the message Jesus Christ cares for the poorest of the poor. He lived a life in solidarity with the poor. And in this documentary here, there's some footage of him talking about how large agribusinesses like Castle and Cook were kicking campesinos off their land. And this was a disastrous thing. And Carney said, if you criticize these multinationals, they call you a communist. He says, we Christians care about this. We want changes. Father Carney was disappeared in 1983, and disappeared means he was killed under mysterious circumstances. If you want to know more, ask me a question about it later. What about our third country, Guatemala? What was going on there? Well, General Efrain Rios Montt was trying to suppress the Mayan. They were fighting against this repressive government I mentioned earlier. And he was actually convicted of trying to exterminate one of the ethnic groups, a Mayan Indian community, and he had wiped out their villages. Now, if we look at total numbers of dead, researchers have found their bodies, have done excavations, and they say 626 villages, 200,000 people died. But what we don't always know is, did the U.S. do anything here? What we know is Rios Montt was convicted in Guatemala, sentenced to 80 years in prison. But he got to appeal, and pretty soon it was overturned. And on a technicality about the recusal of judges, okay, it was overturned, but the Guatemalans still said, thank goodness we had the evidence and we showed that he committed this genocide. But, what did the U.S. do? Okay, so the U.S. had sent some, money the way of the Guatemalans during this genocide. And in this way, they made it possible. Part of the strategy of the genocide is you attack the village, you burn it to the ground, and you herd people into these like concentration camp areas. And the money that the US government kept sending to Guatemala, everyone knew it was going right to this Maya area where these concentrations were set up. So the US has yet to reckon with their role in this atrocity. What about El Salvador? So there were liberation theologians who cared about the poor, who walked with the poor. Rutilio Grande was a Jesuit who was killed in 1977 by the Salvadoran government because of his walking in solidarity with the poor. Now, Oscar Romero, who was the Archbishop of San Salvador at that time, was so touched by the witness of Father Rutilio Grande, he really changed from a more apolitical spiritual person to someone who saw God calling him to speak out in defense of those who were being killed by the government and the military. And he actually asked the U.S. to stop sending military aid to the Salvadoran government, who was killing people, again with the idea that this uprising is communist, and not taking into account people were struggling for their lives because of poverty. There were also 4 church women who were killed at the same time when their bodies were found. When I went to El Salvador at this time in the 80s, I was so impressed because so many parishes, you go to your average parish and it would have a mural saying, these 100 people from our parish are martyrs. They died in the struggle to free the Salvadoran people. Just mind-boggling to see the sacrifice of Salvadoran people to change their government and stop the repression. Now, there was also a Jesuit, Ignacio Ellacuría. He was the rector of the University of Central America, the Jesuit University in San Salvador. And he and the other Jesuits there did a big study. And what they wanted to show is, first of all, what the military is saying, they're not understanding. So Jesuits had a different assessment of the problem in El Salvador, the extent of poverty, the extent of dispossession, how people could not participate democratically. So they had a different solution. They didn't want a military solution. They wanted a negotiated settlement. Nevertheless, they were killed by members of the Salvadoran military. And you may know, because we still celebrate the anniversaries of these slain Jesuits who were killed along with their housekeeper and her daughter by the Salvadoran military. Okay, that was part 4. Liberation theology. Now we're going to follow up on these same themes and take a look at the last 30 years and see how it's impacted the situation of migrants as we know our current challenges with immigration today. First of all, there was legislation like NAFTA and CAFTA. Some say, who benefited from these? Well, some will say the U.S. benefited from these kinds of negotiations in this way. The U.S. could have a market for their cheap exports. So you may know the U.S. stabilized the agricultural sector. The U.S. buys up agricultural products or subsidizes the farmers who are growing them, and then they can sell them at a very cheap price abroad. The problem is this undercuts the livelihood of farmers in other countries who can no longer sell their goods because they can't compete with cheaper price U.S. exports. Another problem is that parts of NAFTA said corporations could sue governments if their environmental protection laws reduce their profits. So corporations really liked this Chapter 11 part of NAFTA. The wording was kind of ambiguous, but they used it in their favor. Corporations use it in their favor to say, this government is trying to reduce my profits by placing all these environmental restrictions. So the people of Mexico and Central America had to deal with environmental fallout from many of the businesses located there. So during this time, what's happening to immigrants? There's push factors like drought, starvation, political unrest. There's pull factors like jobs, hope for asylum, family, and unity. There is so much, if you look at this map, you can see there are areas that had much drought during this time. And even though the Trump administration had a study that says this is driving immigration, they ignored their own study. If at all possible. I realize I'm running out of time. I wanted to give you a few examples, let me just say, about Mexico. There was this Merida plan where the US said, we are going to give you all this money for the war on drugs, and you are going to stop all these drug cartels. And yet, after all these millions of dollars spent, there was still a drug problem in the US. And on top of it, many people had disappeared. And there was a human rights crisis in Mexico. And nevertheless, the US was sending immigrants back across the border, like Laura, who was highlighted in this New Yorker story. She said, don't send me back to Mexico, I'll be killed. And they ignored her, and she was killed after just a routine traffic stop. El Salvador, and so you might have heard, oh, there are gangs in El Salvador, and many immigrants are fleeing these gangs. Well, we have here a father who was interviewed on NPR, and he has explained this. He goes, what happened is, so many Salvadorans fled their country during the 80s because of the Civil War. While they were in Los Angeles, they formed gangs as a kind of self-defense, defending their community against others. Nowadays, what happens? The U.S. picks them up and deports them. El Salvador itself did not have the social services to offer these youths training and rehabilitation. And so really the U.S. ended up deporting people back to El Salvador in a way that spreads crime in El Salvador. And Guatemala has a few cases, this may be my last country, a few cases similar. You might know, right now the U.S. is sending so many asylum seekers to Guatemala because Guatemala signed an agreement with the U.S. The U.S.-Guatemala Asylum Cooperation Agreement. Jimmy Morales says, we're a safe third country. You can send us your asylum seekers. In the meantime, There were more asylum seekers from Guatemala than any other country in Central America. How can they be a safe third country? Basically, it's a deal that Jimmy Morales signed with Trump. What did he get in return? Well, it's interesting because the United Nations was trying to tackle corruption and drug traffickers in Guatemala, and they had an independent commission there. But it depended on Guatemalan presidents always renewing its mandate. In the past, US president asked the sitting president, renew its mandate. Jimmy Morales didn't have to renew its mandate because Trump did not put pressure on him to renew the mandate. UN was about to investigate Jimmy Morales himself. He didn't renew its mandate. He didn't get investigated. And the next thing you know, Jimmy Morales is telling Trump, Guatemala will move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, just like Trump was hoping. So these are some of the relationships that sometimes our government puts together with other countries. And right now, Guatemala is receiving plane loads of folks with COVID-19 cases. So plane loads, and this is National Catholic Reporter. How is COVID-19 spread? First, we hold immigrants and asylum seekers in detention centers. COVID-19 spreads. And then we put folks on a plane. They land in Guatemala, and this is part of the international spread of COVID-19. Now, ideally, I wanted to do one more country, but I do realize I'm out of time. So I am happy at this point to entertain any questions. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Gail. That was a lot. That was a lot. So there's a question from Betty Stafford. And Betty, unmute yourself if I get this wrong. It looks like she's asking what the effects were of the Spanish-American War.
Oh, okay. So the Spanish-American War, that's back in 1898. And in 1898, first of all, Cubans wanted their independence. U.S. says, we're going to help you, but you didn't just help. They stayed in the U.S., Puerto Rico, and in the Philippines. They stayed, and then if any of those folks were motivated to have independence, then the U.S. put down those uprisings. And there was really a mixed motive in the U.S. government at the time about, do we want to be a colonial power like Europeans? And at least some Americans wanted to do that because they had this pent-up energy to expand, like they had during Manifest Destiny. So, as I mentioned, they kept their foothold in Cuba. And so you have to realize when you look at the strained relationships between U.S. and Cuba and why there was even a Cuban Revolution, you can't realize that without knowing. It's the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. It's the aftermath of the U.S. telling Cuba, we can intervene anytime we want, and they did. And the U.S. also kept the naval base there, Guantanamo, which we still have to this day. So the U.S. continues its influence in Cuba. You could say that radicalized the Cubans enough that they wanted to support a revolution. Puerto Rico, up to today, Puerto Ricans are citizens, but they have no congressperson. They have a non-voting congressperson. They have no voting representative in the U.S. Congress. They can't vote for president of the U.S. unless they are on U.S. soil, but in Puerto Rico, they can't. So they're a commonwealth, but they don't have the same rights as other Americans. And these are some of the enduring legacies of the Spanish-American War.
Thank you, Gail. I have another question here from Helen Marie Burns. She's asking, What portion of the Latin American bishops supported the Medellin/Pueblo documents? Was it something like the U.S. response to Vatican II?
Well, okay. It's of course it's a mixed response, but you can say so. Even Pope Paul VI, who in that document I mentioned, he supports the concept that liberation, that as Catholics we are called to care about the liberation of other people. But you know, there's always a little disclaimer, but don't go too far, you know. So it's a measured support. It is nevertheless support. Now, so the Latin American bishops were at the forefront for sure. But as I said, there was also support for this in Vatican II to a certain extent. I don't know the specifics about how many bishops, but you never know. Maybe there's somebody here on this chat who knows the answer to it, the extent to which back in Vatican II. I do know that Vatican II happened because it came out the way it did, because there were active lay theologians as well as clerics who had an agenda caring about the poor and marginalized. Now, for example, Dorothy Day came on a boat, and so many others participated and influenced Vatican II from below.
Good. Okay, thank you. Thank you. And Beverly Safford again asks, why do you feel that the liberation theology movement ended in 1980?
Oh, okay. So I didn't mean that it ended in 1980. It's just I was trying to put together parts 4 and 5, and I just used 1980 as a timeline. But liberation theology is still active today, and there are still liberation theologians today. And some liberation theologians actually took the position of agreeing with people's right to have an armed revolution to defend their liberation. Others would say, no, there's the nonviolent Jesus, but the nonviolent Jesus nevertheless means we should risk our lives and spend our lives in solidarity. It has not ended to this day. It's just the time it was being formulated in the 60s. The wording was being formulated in the 60s. It was being formalized in documents. In the 60s and 70s, throughout the 80s, you had people engaged in it. Sometimes the liberation theologians were kicked out of their countries. Father Carney was kicked out of Honduras in 1979. I wanted to say one liberation theologian who's still active in Honduras today, because that was part that I couldn't get to, would be Padre Melo. He's a Jesuit in Honduras. He runs a center in Honduras. He's concerned about the coup, the machinations of how the popular democratically elected government had been thrown out in 2009 with complicity of, well, orchestrated by generals who had been trained in School of the Americas. And he has been caring for political prisoners. He gives them legal support. He visits them in prison. He visits the widows of people who have lost their lives fighting for land in this movement that tries to win land appropriation. And so there are active liberation theologians there today still.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm wondering if you could, you gave us some of the pieces, but could you kind of give us a synopsis of how the United States action in Central America, Mexico and Central America, the 60s through, I guess, the early 90s, have affected immigration today. You know, why we're getting so many immigrants in terms of their both political and economic actions there has driven immigration.
Thanks so much, because I definitely intended to recap this major point, which is that U.S. intervention through NAFTA, HAFTA, and covert military intervention and environmental destruction has made it so much harder to live in these countries, has increased the violence in these countries, has made farming a more difficult livelihood in these countries. And really, we could say, if we really say, you know, many immigrants, they don't want to come here, they're just so desperate. If we had a better relationship with Mexico and Central America, something closer along the lines of FDR's good neighbor policy, not that it was perfect, but compared to some of the other time frames in our history, where Mexico and Central America were allowed to flourish. Because just think, the Merida Initiative in Mexico, we've given all this money to the military and the police. What if the only way we could deal with the drug problem in the US was more military and more police? Wouldn't we say, wait a minute, what about social services? What about education and jobs and drug counseling? Well, what if the Mexicans had more of that? You know, what if there was a way for them to flourish? What if there was an alternative for gang members in Mexico and Central America to make a livelihood? Now, the thing is, we've kind of wrecked things for decades. So I don't want to sound like tomorrow would be bad. It would be difficult after the damage. But we could see that the U.S. really exported a lot of the problems that Mexico and Central America has. The U.S. just sent these problems down there and didn't care, it seems, because COVID-19 is going down there, you know, gang members, because we have this insular idea of just take care of USA, not realizing how short-sighted it is. Even the government's own stated goals for Merida Initiative, they are not being reached because the means chosen are not good means. So what we really need, there's an author, David Bacon, who talks about the right to stay home. What people really need in Mexico and Central America is a chance to flourish. They need fair trade, they need agriculture and trade policies that will help them to flourish so that there isn't this desperation to leave.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you. That was a great synopsis. Carol Dubitsky is asking you to share your thoughts about the School of the Americas, their training of the military forces that kind of goes with what you've been talking about of these Central American countries and how these forces were then used to kill and oppress their own people. And is the School of the Americas still active today, albeit maybe under another name?
Yes. Okay. So as I said before, how did this school operate? Remember, it's being set up right after World War II. So it has as its idea friendly relations with Latin America, particularly their militaries, and the training manuals that they used in these beginning years. We have copies of the training manuals. They often taught the Latin American militaries about how to put down insurgencies inside your own country. Acting like, you know, people who are having a popular uprising are your enemy, and training them how to figure out who is part of this movement, how to terrorize them selectively, and even how to torture them. Okay, then they took away those torture. They got caught with the torture manuals. They said we deactivated them, but they had them there for quite a while. The more dangerous part, you could say, are these alliances where you can call on the military maybe to do something for you, or they suggest, we want to fight communists in our country and we know you want to get communists. That is part of what happened. For example, in this recent 2009 coup in Honduras, you know, with some of the older coups we know because 25 years have gone by and there's Freedom of Information Act, and we have, you know, Nixon's signature, send the unmarked guns to this person, you know, and it's all known in the public, even if the average American isn't taught it in their history classes. But something as recent as 2009 Honduras, well, there are some whistleblowers who have actually given their testimony to the U.S. Department of Defense, who hasn't done anything yet, who said that the military generals who planned this coup against Zelaya, President Zelaya, who in 2009 was a little bit like Romero insofar as he was part of the rich landed class who had a change of heart once he became president and started caring for the landless and engaging in land distribution and other projects, minimum wage, etc. So these generals decided Zelaya was now a communist, and they went to the U.S. They went, and somewhere in my notes I have the Center for Strategic in Washington, D.C. at one of the forts. It's not even, so School of the Americas that used to be in Panama, and then it moved to Fort Benning, Georgia. But that's not the only place where people are getting their training. So they went to another fort where other Latin American troops are getting their training, and Fort McNair. And they went to their teachers because they took classes there. And so they went to the teachers at Fort McNair and said, should we get rid of this Zelaya? What do you think of our plan? And so at least some whistleblowers had said, you know, their teachers gave them this suggestion. And so they engaged in a coup. In the beginning, Obama and Clinton called it a coup and said they knew nothing about it and said, you know, Honduras should not remove a democratically elected president. And the OAS also spoke out against it. But within a few months, U.S. started changing their tune because, you know, these military guys started working on the U.S. and said, you like your base in Comayagua, don't you? And you wouldn't have liked Zelaya, he's a communist. Okay, so this is the way in which these connections between U.S. military and other countries, they go both ways sometimes. And they marginalize democratic movement, and they unfairly paint all people's movements as if they're nothing but communist puppets when you have church people and humanitarians motivated to make life better for people in their countries. And they're unfairly painted and slated for removal by these militaries.
Thank you, Gail. Yes, thank you. That's been big. Well, I want to thank Professor Presbey for this sweep through history. That was really quite amazing. So if we can give her a round of applause, I know we're, thank you very much. We appreciate your presence and your knowledge and your heart, because obviously your heart is very much in this. Thank you, and thank you all for being with us this evening. We appreciate your presence and your questions. Thank you.